So when we think about achievement, we're thinking about one point in time. So achievement in the context of the universal tier is telling us about student likelihood to meet later expectations. So here I like to think of developmental growth charts, right? They tell us how they predict the likelihood, right, of meeting later expectations. When we talk about growth, we're looking at the change in student learning between 2 points of time. And not only that, but we can compare this change to an expected change, right? To make sure that students are learning at a rate that will either get them or keep them on the right developmental trajectory. But growth doesn't actually tell us anything about where a student is in terms of their overall risk. It's really important, though, because it lets us know if a student is learning at an acceptable rate to stay on track or meet their goals. So first, we'll explore if students are meeting expectations. So this is an example of a report from FastBridge Assessments. In this case, it's what's called Fast Track Math. It's a series of 2 to 3 universal screening assessments that students take. In this case, at this grade level, it's 2 assessments. It feels like one to students. It's computer-based, but then there are multiple scores that teachers get from that assessment. And so you can see here that at the top, in the body, teachers can see how each student performs, but at the top, they can see overall the percentage of their students who met the benchmark or the expectation for that assessment and on that score, looking at that skill. And then the report also provides them with a whole group recommendation, which we'll come back to in a minute. So overall here, we see that students, when we look at number or place value, more entry-level mathematics, more early math skills, we have the majority of students are meeting benchmarks and expectations in that level. We do see, though, that a lower number of students are automatic with their math operations. And then when we look overall at general math skills, we also see that only about half of students, or 52%, are meeting expectations. And so in this case, I might want to go back and see, okay, so we want to do something universally for all students in order to improve math outcomes and get more math growth between now and winter. And so at the top of this particular report, there'll be some recommended interventions. But in this case, we likely would want to do something more school-wide and would want to intervene with the whole group, because we likely have, as we were talking about earlier, too many students who need intervention to be able to provide evidence-based intervention too. And so we want to look at improving our universal tier in math for this group of students. In addition to looking at growth for individual students or groups of students that way and looking at their raw growth that a student makes, regardless of when they start, of where they start in terms of risk, you can also look at the category of risk changes over the course of a year. So this is an example of a report that's called an effectiveness report. It's in the EduClimber product. And what this is showing you is 2 time periods. In this case, it's fall and spring. And you'll see at the first time period on the left, you'll see the percent of students that are in each of these risk bands. And so in this case, it's advanced, low risk, some risk, and high risk. Then on the right, you see the same students at their next assessment or spring screening. And what you see in the middle are the movement that those students make. And so if I have a system that is really strong in the universal tier, I can look at this and I would expect that at least 95% of students who start the year meeting expectations, so in low risk or college pathways, end the year in low risk and college pathways. And so this report can be used for lots of reasons, but if we think about high quality universal instruction, if you asked, and I've asked lots of teachers, I've asked lots and lots of teachers around the country, what percentage of students who start the year on track do you expect to grow enough to end the year on track? And every single time I've asked the teachers that question, they've said 100%. I expect all of my students who begin the year on track to grow enough to end the year on track. And so when we think about and we have the opportunity to look at our data by benchmark to benchmark, we can look to see what percent of students who started the year on track grew enough to stay on track. And we would expect our universal tier to support that. We can also do fun things with a report like this in terms of intervention to look at the effectiveness of our interventions. But today, obviously, we're focused on the universal tier. So let's talk about what whole group intervention is. Whole group intervention is instruction that we provide in addition to tier one, what we're already providing as part of our core instruction for all students. It's provided to all students, and it focuses on standards students should have already mastered. So it could be standards that we've addressed this year, or it could be as we go into next fall standards that as we're thinking about preparing for different units and different types of conceptual skills and learning those, that we want to make sure that we help all students in making sure they have the background knowledge that they need in order to be successful there, given the unfinished learning that may have occurred this year. It allows for, and a really big benefit of whole group intervention is that it allows for additional practice with feedback. So let's look here. As you're thinking about what to focus on for whole group intervention, you can choose what to focus on from your universal screening data. So they should be able to provide you with some initial information to support your teams in making those decisions. So this is an example from that report within FastBridge that I showed earlier. Here, this happens to be a reading example. It's going to show you exactly a recommendation for what to focus on in both a plan form as well as specific interventions that you might use with the whole group. But you can use your universal screening. If you're using a different universal screening tool, you can use those data in different ways to help you identify what are some of the skills that we might be able to target. So let's talk about an example of whole group intervention. So here's an example of a whole group intervention within FastBridge. It's a repeated reading with a partner. And so within FastBridge, it provides the teacher materials, the student materials, as well as the instruction that is provided, and it's designed to be 20 minutes a day, 4 days a week. So, and I've worked with schools before that have looked at whole group instruction in this type of way, and I've seen things like in middle schools, being able to schools taking 5 minutes a day in every single class. So if you have a 6-period middle school, that would be 30 minutes a day, where students are using a quick evidence-based routine in repeated reading of some kind or kind of partner reading that would help in impact fluency and would allow students to then, they would get, as part of just their core instruction, teachers could choose which routine to use, which day. They could choose the content. So it would be, if they were in science class, it would be science text. But students would be using that at least for 5 minutes a day across all content areas. So they get 30 extra minutes a day of practice. And what we see is that in very short amounts of time, we see large student gains in skills through that type of whole group intervention. We're not often thinking about the amount of time that we're giving. And so that idea of the protected instructional time or what we can gain by increasing instructional time is really powerful. So this is just a sample text from a book that I had on my shelf, which is Teach Your Child to Read in 100 Easy Lessons. And this it's essentially a curriculum for parents. And so it has lessons, right? And so if we assume that we have a curriculum in place or materials, well, we're getting through a lesson a session, right? And so we think about how many lessons we would get through a week. And so in this case, let's say that we had 10 weeks of instruction go by and we got through 3 lessons a week in this instructional program, right? And this is whole class. This is what we would be reading after 3 weeks. So you can see what that is. Now let's say, though, that we increased either the frequency or the duration of our time together in order to be able to get through 4 lessons a week. So if we were able to teach 4 lessons a week, here is what students would be reading after the same 10 weeks. You can see that the sentences are longer. Obviously, the words are more challenging, and students can read more if they receive more instruction, right? Now let's look and see what happens if we get through 5 lessons a week. Here you can see again that it is much longer, and the sentence structure is also a little bit more varied, and we have more going on. And so really what this shows us is the amount of instruction really matters. And so when we're thinking about both core instruction, when we're thinking about the frequency and duration of our core instruction, that makes a huge difference. But this also is part of the reason that when we think about why the universal tier is really important for us to continue to work on and to have a super effective universal tier, this is a piece of that too. Because in our intervention systems, we want to be able to get through 5 lessons a week in those intervention systems as well, so that we have strong achievement gains in those interventions too. Otherwise, what we start to see are interventions where we rarely have students who close achievement gaps in interventions, and then we start to have systems and schools where we don't really expect interventions to work anymore. And we primarily see interventions being requested because we want to try to get students special education services, because we haven't really experienced interventions that are effective, because we haven't necessarily had interventions that are robust enough, because we've had so many students who've needed them, because we haven't worked enough on our universal tier effectiveness. And another way to improve the universal tier immediately is by intensifying what we're already doing. So we can increase dosage or frequency and duration of our teaching to result in higher amount of instruction that students receive, right? And this is the example from before, but it's very salient, right? Into increasing the frequency or duration or the dosage of our instruction makes a difference in what students can do. So to increase dosage, we can do things like increase the teacher-led instructional time versus student independent time. We can increase the number of days a week that we focus on specific lessons. And so I know it's not an easy thing to do, right? To increase the duration of time, the dosage that we're spending, but it's something that's really powerful. And so here are some examples of ways that we can increase dosage. So from frequency, obviously adding time to what we're already doing in tier 1 can be powerful, right? And so if we see in the fall of first grade that we have a lot of students who are struggling with their decoding skills and phonics skills, we can add more phonics time in specifically, right? Add more practice in those skills. We can add more time, but that's also sometimes challenging. We could also provide more spaced practice for students. So maybe I'm going to build in 3 times a day where we spend 5 minutes playing a game that works specifically on phonics skills. And so it's very intentional, and it gives the additional frequency over time and is great for all students, but it's also super great for students who struggle with memory or things like that, because they get that frequent practice all day long. We can also replace independent work with teacher-directed instruction. So if there are times right now in your schedule where students are doing more independent work, if we replace that with teacher-directed instruction, that increases the frequency or the dosage of that instruction. And then try to teach a skill or a program daily. If right now we're doing it maybe every other day or not quite as often, teaching it more often. And for duration, really expanding instructional times is one way, obviously. And then, or really thinking about the routines that we use and teaching behavior and instructional routines, really maximizing the engaged time that we have, so that it might be the same number of minutes, but we're actually getting more instructional time because of the routines that we're using, or the behavior that we've taught students to make the classroom more efficient. So in addition to all of those things, we can think about how schools can support data use. So as we're doing whole group intervention or intensifying our tier 1 resources through next year, we also need to think about then how to support educators to use data. There's a lot of evidence that educators using data results in student learning improvement. We know that leaders in systems also are really essential to empowering teachers to be able to use data to support student learning. And so there are many ways that we can support the use of data. Providing dedicated time to review and act on data is first and foremost and really important. Having protocols that can help teams use data efficiently and quickly in their meetings can be really helpful. And inviting others to model the facilitation of data conversations can also can take a big bump in the quality of those conversations over time. And then just continuing to talk about the importance of that work, celebrating team achievements during staff meetings, and really continuously sharing and discussing the purpose of the work with educators, and engaging them in that conversation can be really helpful, because while you're thinking about this on these calls, right, and other conversations that you might be in, we need teachers to engage in that too, so that they are also feeling really empowered in that data use.